want to say about bagels. Sort of a weekend project, but not really so bad. Not as much work as you might think it is. Okay. Hey everyone, I'm Claire Saffitz. I'm very excited today to show you my recipe for homemade bagels. I think for anyone that did sourdough baking in the beginning of quarantine and then abandoned that because it was just like a little too much to take on, this is a great place to land. It's also kind of magical. I think when you learn that you can make something at home that you originally thought you could only buy, it's a really fun, empowering process. So the ingredients are not hard to find. There is one specialty ingredient that you'll need, and it is called barley malt syrup. You can find it at well-stocked grocery stores or health food stores. In a pinch, you can use molasses as a substitute, but barley malt syrup imparts a kind of classic malted flavor that you find in traditional bagels. It never goes bad. You can just keep it in your pantry. And then everything else is really standard. Bread flour, kosher salt, active dry yeast, some oil, and then of course ingredients for toppings. I prefer an everything bagel because I don't want to have to choose. So you're going to want to start really the evening or the afternoon before, and then you'll set yourself up to bake them the next morning. Boil and then bake. Let's start, right? Start with the dough. So, okay, the first thing I want to do is proof the yeast. What does that mean? So active dry yeast is these granules, and coating the yeast granules is a dehydrated coating, basically on the outside. And what you want to do to activate the yeast is dissolve that coating. So usually recipes with active dry yeast start by dissolving the yeast in some warm water, often with some kind of sugar source added. I need someone to explain to me what malt means, because there's like malted milk powder. My understanding is that when something is malted, it's like sprouted. So this is what is done with barley for beer making and various other grains for making distilled alcohols. And we use the same barley malt syrup for boiling the bagels. And that imparts a little bit of malty sweetness to the dough, and then also helps create this really burnished, crusty outside to the bagel. It was very important to me that these bagels are crusty, because that's the hallmark of a bagel. Okay, that looks pretty good. So the yeast dissolves and it starts to feed on the sugars in the barley malt syrup, and I'll start to see some active foaming and puffing. Just let it alone, and that's how you're gonna know that your yeast is alive. But it's probably fine, even if you don't see lots of active bubbling. Like skirting around the controversy of this recipe, and because everyone has, I think, their own idea about what a bagel is, I tend to err on the side of the more traditional New York style bagel. So a bagel that is smaller than the ones you'll typically see in like the average bakery, is very chewy and is very crusty. And if it's fresh, doesn't need toasting. I'm not using a mixer for this recipe, and I'll talk about why. Whenever I'm making bread, I like to weigh, at the very least, the flour and the water for the most accurate proportions. If you don't have a kitchen scale, you can just do volume measurements. But pay close attention to the texture of the dough, because that's gonna tell you if you need to add a little more flour or if you add a little more water. So I'm using white bread flour. You can add a little bit of whole wheat flour. It will kind of create a slightly more complex flavor, but it also will make your bagels a little less chewy. So it's just about kind of the balance that you want. I think it's 6.5 cups, something like that. Bread flour has the highest protein content, and it is the certain proteins in flour that when they come into contact with liquid create gluten. Gluten is what makes bagels chewy. So for the chewiest bagel, I recommend sourcing bread flour if you can find it. I know for a fact that my yeast is alive because I just used this jar of yeast to make other batches of bagels. So I'm gonna go ahead and proceed. So again, if you're using volume, that's fine. Come on out, hold on. Oh God, convert. Oh, thank God, okay. So you can see there's not a lot of ingredients in this dough. It's a little cleaner if you add the wet to the dry. So I'm just kind of making a little well in here. This will be familiar to anyone who's made pasta dough, for example, by hand. This bowl is too small. Oh well, that'll be fine. And I'm just slowly incorporating the flour into the center. And all I want to do in this step is bring the dough together. I have now this dough that is kind of coming together. And so I'm just going to knead it in the bowl a few times until it picks up most of that flour. So this is where I switch to my hands. Now I have this rough dough, and I'll turn it out onto my work surface. And now we're gonna go onto the kneading step. Be prepared. This part is a little bit of a workout. As I said, I'm doing all this by hand, and I'll talk about why. But basically, it's very hard to overwork bagel dough. The more you work it, the more you'll achieve that chewy texture. So you're gonna be here for a little while kneading it. And I'm not doing this in a stand mixer because the dough for bagels is very stiff, so it has a lower proportion of water to flour, and it doesn't really do a whole lot in a stand mixer, and it's probably not gonna be great for the motor. The stickiness will kind of disappear a little bit as I continue to work it and even out the hydration. But if it's really sticky and kind of stubborn, you're gonna wanna add a little bit of additional flour. Really what you're supposed to do is keep one hand clean for the scraper and one hand full of dough. Sort of didn't do that. It's a lot harder to add moisture to dough than it is to add flour. So you wanna hold back on the flour until you absolutely need it. Need it, N-E-E-D. This part is like, if you have other people in the household who like need to occupy a little bit of their time, just put them in front of the dough and have them do some of the kneading, because this step, you might be here for a good 15-20 minutes. I think it's really fun to knead dough. My stance for kneading is I have one foot in front of the other, so I have this kind of ability to rock. And basically what I'm trying to do is work the dough, and I'm kind of moving like my whole body forward, and what I'm really doing is I'm taking a part of the dough, folding it on top of itself, and then pressing away from my body. And then I give the dough sort of a 90-degree turn, and then just keep repeating that motion. I mean, that's my technique. There's different ways to knead dough, but the important thing is that we are really working it. And this is a texture that I would describe as tacky, but not sticky. And I'll tell you, so if you like poke your finger into it, the dough will cling to my finger but will release cleanly rather than actually stick to it, and I'll end up pulling some of the dough off with my finger. It's an indication that the dough will stick to itself. And that's important when we go to roll out the bagels, and I'll show you why. It's just kind of good to get your whole body into it. Set a timer, like zone out. My dad used to go get bagels on Sunday mornings on his bike and bring them home for the family, and we'd have bagels. So I sort of like, a Sunday morning bagel was always a tradition in my family. There actually was a great bagel shop in St. Louis growing up called Basically Bagels, which is sadly no more. And I still think to this day that like a bagel with the works is one of the greatest foods you could possibly eat. Oh, so good. See, now I zoned out thinking about bagels, and the dough is pretty much ready. So. This dough really rises 2 times. Dust it with a little flour, and then I can go back into the bowl that you use for mixing, and then I'll cover it, and this is gonna rise until it's about doubled in size. The forming is really fun. That's my favorite part. I'm gonna set up 2 sheet trays for the second rise of the bagels. This is just an insurance policy. This dough I set up a little earlier, and it's all risen. It has a weird like boil here because it has an air bubble. I'm just gonna pop that. It's very hard to tell when something spherical doubles in size, so just estimate. At this point, it's not an exact science. What I wanna do is release some of the gases that built up during the first rise, so I'm just gonna kind of lightly punch it down. We say punch it down, but it really just means sort of like, disturb the dough, knock out that gas. It's a very satisfying texture. Okay, so now I'm gonna portion the dough into 12 equal pieces. So I'm making a dozen bagels. They're a little more than 4 ounces each. I follow a lot of bread bakers on Instagram, and I love videos like from the bakery where you see someone portioning out the dough, and they're such experts that like they can nail the size on the first try. And like I'm doing lots of like cutting off and adding and taking away. Bread dough is very ASMR. Like there's something about the texture. It's neither liquid nor solid. It's in this like weird liminal state of matter. I love it. Okay. It's flubber, exactly. Now I'm gonna do a step called pre-shaping. So this step is important because it helps to give the bagels a very smooth, even look. If I were to just go ahead and start forming the bagels the way the dough is now, they would have kind of a bumpy, slightly irregular exterior, and I want like a nice, smooth, kind of professional looking bagel. Take all of the bizarre, irregular edges from my dough portion and pinch them all together. So I kind of create this like teardrop shape, or almost like a garlic bulb, sort of. and then I put it seam side down, so that's kind of domed side up. So I kind of make like a claw with my hand, or like I'm gonna play the piano, and I put it over the dough, so I'm kind of cupping it, and then just give it some rapid rotations on the countertop. Don't add flour. So this step really needs the friction between the dough and the countertop, and it doesn't stick, and then you have this nice, even, beautiful little dough. And actually, if you get good at it, you can do 2 at once. So you're really dragging the dough across the surface as you rotate it. Okay, so there are my 12. How am I gonna do this? I really worked the dough, and as you work gluten, you increase its elasticity, meaning that ability of the dough to contract. So if I were to try to roll these out, the dough would kind of spring back and not want to hold its shape. So these just need to rest for a minute, and then I'll come back and shape them, like 5 minutes. I waited about 5 minutes. It's kind of hard because I get very excited to move on to the next step. There's a couple of different methods. I go the more traditional route, which I'll show you, but I'll also show you the other way in case you, I don't know, it's like a little easier, I guess. The more traditional method for forming is to roll the dough into a snake with slightly tapered ends and roll it around your hand and pinch the ends together, so you make a loop. The thicker part is gonna go on the back of my hand, and then where the ends meet is gonna go where my palm is, kind of right in between where my fingers meet my palm. And then I'm gonna pinch, and then go like seam side down on the surface and roll it back and forth a few times. And that's gonna seal those ends together. And that's why I was talking a lot about the hydration of the dough, that you want the dough to adhere to itself so that those ends stick together. Because I have smaller hands, I then kind of go back in and like stretch the dough into a slightly bigger ring. If you were to make a ring that looked like it had the shape of a bagel before the boiling and baking phase, you would get like a dinner roll. Like the whole thing contracts and that hole really kind of closes up. So you end up having to make a much wider ring at this stage than you think you have to. So here's the other way to make a bagel. Basically, you just poke the hole in the center and then do that sort of like stretching from the hole. But there's something about the way the bagel looks when you have those two thinner ends that are sealed and like meat on one side that just gives a much more classic bagel shape, and like this one is to me a more donut-like somehow. I lived in Montreal and I would like watch the like master bakers forming bagels in the famous Montreal bagel shops, and they're so good at it and fast. I'm not an expert at it. It's gonna be very controversial. Even though I grew up in St. Louis, I grew up with a New York style bagel, and that's my preferred bagel. Although there is a lot to love about the Montreal style bagel, mostly what I love about it is every time you go to a Montreal bagel shop, they're warm and fresh out of the oven. That's all I'm gonna say about that. Not even gonna get into cinnamon raisin bagels. And like I don't know what that is. I also remember when I was like, I don't know, probably a teenager, I was like sleeping over at a friend's house and we had bagels for breakfast in the morning, and she put butter and cream cheese on her bagel. And I was like, had never done that before, and then I tried it and I was like, that is delicious. Why choose? Eat the bagel the way you want to eat it, but just don't add raisins. Okay, the whole bagel will puff as it boils and then bakes, so I want to just widen the rings a little bit so that I don't end up with something that's like very tall and kind of tight. So only after resting will they be able to extend and not shrink back. The idea is we're setting this up, letting these rest overnight in the refrigerator where they will sort of go through their second very slow rise. So I put the plastic on it rather loosely. I don't want to like seal them so that the dough itself can't really expand. And then just to create a closed environment, I go over top with a damp towel. So just like that. If you wanted to bake them same day, I would say let them hang out in the fridge for a minimum of 4 hours, but you can go up to 24. Yay, I'm so excited. Okay, so through a little TV magic, the next day and we're ready to boil the bagels. The bagel boiling is sort of like a little bit of a dance. There's some choreography, and it's gonna be a little hard to like pause and, you know, get something out. This is a step where mise en place is gonna be really important. I have a wide Dutch oven here, toppings out on plates. So I have just a mix here, sesame, poppy, salt. This is dehydrated onion, caraway, and then I basically mix everything together and I have an everything blend right here. And also crucially, I have my oven preheating to 450 Fahrenheit, and I arrange the racks, one in the top third, one in the bottom third, because we're gonna bake the bagels. Do I bake them one at a time? I think I bake them one at a time. I just need a rack in the middle. Oops. Okay, so I have a rack in the middle of the oven and it's preheating to 450 because we're baking 6 at a time. So I'm just gonna grab one tray from the fridge for now. Your dough could be at all different stages of rising. So we're gonna do a little test to make sure there's enough gas in the bagels that they're ready to bake. They've puffed up really nicely, resting in the fridge. They look a lot more like bagels now. The dough kind of springs back. So that's how I know that there is air in the bagel. Basically, I'm gonna transfer one to this bowl of water and it should float. If it floats, we're ready to go. Floating bagel, we're good to go. If for some reason your bagel does not float, don't worry. All you wanna do is take both trays out of the fridge, leave them at room temperature, they'll warm up a little bit, they'll start to rise a little faster, and then start doing the float test, maybe check every 10-15 minutes, and then you'll know when they're ready to go. This is where I'm using the barley malt syrup again. I'm gonna add about a 1/4 cup to the water. It's not a measured amount of water, so what I'm looking for is really like a concentration. I want the mixture to look like a strong iced tea. And then I'm gonna add a little bit of baking soda. This helps to create a really burnished, kind of crackly, crunchy exterior to the bagel. So boiling does a number of things. It basically like starts to set or gelatinize the starches on the exterior of the dough so that it doesn't rise and puff up in this dramatic way. It kind of sets and like holds the interior so that you end up getting this sort of dense, chewy bagel rather than something that is more roll-like, I suppose. That boiling will also give a really burnished, shiny exterior. Also a hallmark of bagels is that they have little tiny blisters on the exterior. Passing the float test, that's gonna help you achieve that super crackly, crunchy exterior. Actually, let's go faster. Right. Sorry, this is the whole watch pot adage. It's a thing. That sounds, it will eventually boil, but I really want to look. I really want to look. I think I can feel it. Damn it. With this, okay. All right, so we're just below a boil. As this comes to a boil, it's gonna create a ton of foam. You can skim that off the surface. It just kind of gets in the way of boiling the bagels. This is the most exciting part, and the part that increases my heart rate slightly, which is the boiling. Because at this step, it's like once you start, you're in it. There's not really a great pausing point. I think I'm gonna put a little bit of oil on my hands to prevent any sticking when I transfer them into the pot. I also put oil on my hands as moisturizer when I'm in the kitchen. Just wanna peel one off the parchment into the pot. I'm gonna keep going, and then when I have 3 in there, I will turn on the timer. Oh God, my timer, hold on. Face ID, okay. I'm gonna transfer them. There's like a rounded side. Ooh. And I'm just gonna transfer them to this rack. You can see they've puffed up quite a bit. They will deflate a little bit after you boil them. That's normal. They'll puff up again in the oven. So don't worry if they look a little flat. They've taken on kind of a golden color from all that barley malt syrup. They're still a little bit wet from that boiling, which is good because that's how the topping is gonna adhere to the bagel. You just kind of go for like a quick dip on both sides. I'm not applying any pressure to the bagels. This part is so fun. So now these go into the oven and they're gonna bake, they're gonna puff up, and they're gonna get really dark, golden brown, and be super delicious. The first tray we put in the oven is done. And I'm going by mostly color on that one. I want it to be a very, very deep golden brown. I'm gonna put this tray in, and this will go another 18 to 20. Okay. we're really ready for our bagel extravaganza. I'm so excited to open a bagel, dress it up, and then eat it. And this is what I'm looking for. This is a sign of a well-proofed bagel. Because these are truly fresh bagels, I don't need to toast them. If these were to sit out for an hour or so though, or longer, I would probably give them a toast, but at this stage it's not necessary. It's gonna be really chewy. I can just feel it, like it has a bounce to it. This is gonna be a delicious chewy bagel. Topping that broke off. My husband calls me a penguin because I really like fishy fish. I don't think about it as being a bad thing. Okay. All right, there's no elegant way to eat a bagel, I don't think. So salty. Put a lot of salt in that everyday mix, but so good. A bagel should be salty. This is really the only way I'll eat an untoasted bagel. Super fresh. You have those tiny like micro crackles from that blistered exterior. I would be hard pressed to come up with a more perfect dish than a bagel and cream cheese with lox. It's perfect. I think I'm more into whitefish. It's so good. My God, it's salty. Sorry, do I have everything on my mouth? I feel like I have it all over. No? All right, well, I'm basically gonna sit here and eat the rest of this bagel, and then I'm gonna go take a nap because there's a lot of food. It's not the lightest meal, but it is certainly delicious. And I think that this bagel recipe is such a fun project, mixing the dough by hand, forming them, boiling them, and then you get to create this huge bagel spread with all different varieties of bagels and really customize it to whatever you want to eat on your bagel. So I think you'll be surprised to learn that the version of bagels you make at home is as good, if not even better, than the ones you get from your local grocery store or bakery. It's just really fun to learn, like, I can make this thing at home, and it turns out really great. Again, just don't put raisins in them.